I met the woman that you call if you're the lawyer for a mass murderer. She comes in, and your client's been convicted, given the death sentence, and you want to mitigate the sentence.
Okay.
There's one person you call. It's this woman. I met her. I was like, whoa, that's your job? She goes, yes. So I've been interviewed. I go and I meet with her every now and again, and I'm collecting tape. And one of the things she's a trained clinician. Today, we talked about the difficulty of talking to people who have been traumatized.
Yeah.
I was just curious. So she's someone who started doing that particular line of work after 25 years as a trained clinician. Mm-hmm. You were coming at this. You were putting your toe in some ways troubled, not equally, but in very troubled waters. Was it hard coming at this without that kind of training and experience, or what was the?
Go ahead.
I think without having each other, to be honest, I think it would have been a little bit more challenging. I mean, we were able to, if one of us was there, we were able to text each other and to have conversations. If we had a really hard interview, after every day that we were there together, we would talk, we would debrief, we would drink wine, we would laugh, gallows humor sometimes. But it was hard, right? But we had breaks between when we would go there that kind of helped sort of deal with it. But I think that there was the rewarding piece to it too. We weren't coming at it as somebody's clinician. We weren't there to try and help them. We just wanted to listen, and people would tell us everything, and they would feel better afterwards more often than not. And that was rewarding, right? And we could walk away from it and say, okay, that was really interesting and really important. And we're going to honor that story. And now let's have some wine, I suppose.
Yeah.
I think there was some freedom in not being a clinician because, one of the things is that, clinical psychology and psychiatry really dominate all of the knowledge production about suicide. And I think that's a mistake, because I think we're not going to be able to effectively prevent suicide if we don't consider some of the forces that are beyond that clinical encounter, which is what they inevitably tend to emphasize. We're much more interested in how do we build worlds that are worth living in? How do we build schools that feel healthy and functional and where places where kids can thrive? So I think in that sense, us not being clinicians was a gift. I do worry, of course, about keeping people safe and making interviews, psychologically safe for people. Mm-hmm. We did have clinicians on call that we could talk to at any time if we had a concern about, especially about a kid, but anybody. We also had tons of local resources that we were constantly sharing with our interviewees, and we did actually connect one child to care that they very much needed, and we facilitated that conversation in a way that I think was a really powerful intervention into that kid's life. They weren't suicidal, but I just felt like they had so much grief that I just asked them if I could help them with that. We don't break confidentiality for that, so we won't tell parents for that particular concern, but actually the kid was really excited and really glad that I would help them figure out how to access therapy, and it ended up, being a really positive experience. So I think it's it's good, but you also have to know your limits and know when to call in a clinician to make sure everybody's.
It's a really interesting point about how there are limits to the perspectives that a clinician would bring to that conversation. Can you talk a little bit more? What are they, if they are missing something, what exactly are they missing?
I mean, I think let's be honest, right? All science, we end up asking questions that are relevant to the way we've been trained and to the things that confront us in our faces, right? And so we're sociologists, so it's then not a surprise that we're interested in how the social world shapes individual child development and well-being, and ultimately, of course, suicide risk in the case of our work. So I think that clinical psychologists and psychiatrists, they're really interested in, we have a suicidal child in front of us. Well, first, or you have a child in distress, how do we figure out if they are suicidal? Then how do we figure out how likely they are to actually attempt or die? Those are the things that therapists are sort of obligated to figure out, and so that ends up directing a lot of their research, right? So I think that it's it's sort of inevitable, right? But it is also why I love, and I think Seth loves, like, reading broadly. Like, we read a huge amount of anthropology. I've read a huge amount of clinical psychology of suicide and adolescent psychiatry of suicide. So we try to read broadly, but ultimately, I think all disciplines have their bias. And it's only through, having real interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary conversations that we can actually do the kind of science that's going to help kids' lives and improve suicide prevention.
I'll give an anecdote to this to hammer this home. When I first went to UBC in 2017, I think maybe 6 months into being there, there was a cluster that happened on campus. It was kept very quiet. It didn't leak out into the newspapers or anything. And the mental health services called me in to, like, with some of the other people in other disciplines. And there was a clinical psychologist there, very famous for what he does. And his solution was to offer, and it was a perfectly acceptable and a really important solution, was to offer free counseling and just to advertise that, because it was happening in, like, the fraternities and the sororities, and it was being done in a very visible way, that it was being repeated. And so all these kids were distressed, like really distressed. And so his solution was to give therapy, and that was great. My response was, has anybody gone over there and talk to anybody? Have you gone into the sorority and fraternity and had a conversation about why this is happening, how they're feeling about this, what they plan to do, like how to, like, move past this, like how do we do postvention? And they sort of wrote me off on that because it sounded just too big, right? It was a much bigger project than giving them a phone number. And nothing happened, God forbid, nothing serious that I know of happened since then, but that a sociologist would attack it just differently. We'd want to know, well, what's happening in these 2 or 3 fraternities? Like, and how is everybody reading this and understanding it now? And, how are we keeping them safe? Like, how are we going to fix this?
Yeah. I'm reminded, this is a dumb analogy, but I'm a runner and I had a problem with my knee. And I went to an orthopedic surgeon and he's like, yeah, we can go in there and clean it up. Yeah. Then I go to the guy who does his injections, and without even doing anything, he's like, oh, yeah, I can schedule an injection for you. And I went through 4 different. Finally, I went to a physical therapist who works at the ballet, and she said, walk down the aisle, of her office. She goes, oh, that's what's wrong with you. It's the first time anyone had asked me to move, and the first time anyone had actually evaluated me as a kind of whole person. Everyone else was focused on I went to a foot guy who said it was a foot. And the knee guy said it was a knee. Like, it was crazy, but it was exactly what which is, it's a kind of it's the sort of argument for sociology, right? An important one that I feel like it's not the most fashionable of disciplines at the moment, and maybe it should be, right?
Well, I agree.